Okay, so we're going to go and get started. This is Laura Gardino, and I am Pat Don. And this is a re-recording of the webinar we had yesterday, June 2nd, because we had some technical difficulties apparently associated with Zoom's 5.0 update somehow disabled my webinar. So thank God Laura knows what she's doing on that as she sort of took over, and this is great, except that we had some difficulties with the recording, so we had to re-record this morning. This is sort of a lesson for people on the use of technology, which is check your tech. About an hour before that meeting, Laura and I had a little touch base as we normally do, and instead of going on Zoom and doing our touch base on Zoom, I went and did it with another site, which was a mistake, obviously. If I had done it on Zoom, I would have known better that something wasn't quite right with my computer setup. So anyway, we're going to go ahead and get started with this particular lecture that we were going to give yesterday. Laura did most of it, but I'm going to go ahead and get started with sharing. Anyway, one of the things that I want to point out about materials that you need to use for lecture is that I've talked to many professors recently, and many of them are simply going and taking the Zoom mode of recording and keeping lectures or doing lectures live, and then they're trying to simply take their 75-minute lecture and stick it in there. And this is a disaster for crash and burn. If you do this, not only will your students go away after watching about 20 minutes of Zoom, in addition to that, by the third or fourth week of class, you're going to get very sick and tired of trying to do live Zooms or live e-conferencing or even recording hour and 15-minute lectures for Zoom. And you have to understand that the two environments are completely different. The environment of the online is not the same as the classroom. In the classroom, you have a tremendous amount of capability of projecting yourself that you simply do not have online, and you shouldn't attempt it online. You shouldn't assume that those capabilities of using your hands, using your voice, using your body, moving around the room, going in between, being able to read the audience is key. I mean, you're not a trained actor that can basically emote and do the things that actors do, even though you can't see the audience out there, or some kind of a broadcaster who can look into a webcam or into a camera and be able to do this. It's going to be very difficult. Therefore, as I said last time, and Laura's emphasized herself, you've got to up the game with your curriculum. Your curriculum has to carry more of the weight. So I'm showing here now a slide where you have certain principles or certain concepts that you have to keep in mind if you're going to prepare lecture for an online situation. These are research, this is social factors, these are quality matters. And let me go through these, and then we're going to explain how to apply those into a lecture design that will work in the online setting. First of all, there is 20 minutes where the human attention span can absorb in a passive way what you are saying. After that, you've got a problem, because all human beings, not just 20-year-olds, all human beings will have difficulty with absorbing the information. The attention span drops from about 80% down to like 40%, somewhere between the 20th minute and the 40th minute, and then it really drops off from there. So first of all, you've got to sort of think about the way you're presenting things as if they were in 20-minute segments, okay? Secondly, the lecture, we oftentimes think of lecture as verbally giving information to students. Actually, a lecture is a condensed version of the discipline of your field, of your discipline, all the information that's critical. You could go on and on about lots of other pieces of information, but this is in an introductory class, your condensation of that critical information. It does not have to be carried verbally. It can be carried textually, it can be carried in video, as well as in a verbal mode. So first of all, get yourself out of the thought that you've got to present everything talking at students, okay? The third thing is, now you also have to decide, okay, if I'm going to use various modes, which parts of my lecture should go into verbal, which parts should go into video, which parts should go into textual. And that's very important, that decision, which we will talk about a little further. In addition, with quality matters, always multiple proximate assessments. In other words, every week in an online class, you should be giving several assessments that are assessing the things that you delivered in that class. It's very easy for online students to put off everything for 5 weeks and then try to cram for that 5-week midterm exam that you usually do in your online classes. The next thing is you want to do things that are interactive. You've got active learning interludes that you can do in the lecture to go and essentially bring the students into what you are talking about. And then, of course, there's diverse technology. If you use an asynchronous mode, you have less diversity of technology. The more you go in the synchronous way, the more diversity you have in your technology. And the more diverse the technology, the more interesting for students. All of these things are designed to create student engagement. Okay, so let's go ahead and have a look at that first question of, if I'm going to present lectures in a verbal, textual, or video mode, what is my criteria for selecting which things are going to go into a verbal lecture if I'm thinking about 20 minutes of live Zoom lecturing, or if I'm going to record something in Zoom or in various other screencasting technologies that you have out there. How do I make that choice? Well, the way that I would do it is I would choose lectures or parts of my lecture that require me to explain complex things, that require a lot of analysis, a lot of evaluation, that are very conceptual in nature. Things that are more narrative or are more descriptive or a process or an example or, you know, any one of those types of things, those would be things that I would put in a textual lecture mode. And I think students would accept all of these things being in different modes. If you have a good criteria for choosing, the harder stuff is going to go to verbal, the easier stuff will go to lecture, textual lecture. So here's an example of what I would do. I'm a world historian. Laura's an American historian. There are many psychologists out there, political scientists, but we all kind of have similar sort of design functions when we're thinking about lecture. This is an example on the left in the blue column where in a 4 to 5 week section of my world history class, it's very typical in Word to block out a period of time and then talk about what's going on in the world, various locations of the world prior to the 20th century. And in this period, 1700 to 1820, I would always have a week when I'm doing the Age of Enlightenment, because this is one of the great intellectual movements in world history. It happens to be something in Europe, but it is one of the great intellectual movements. And so when I look at my lectures, these are the things that I would do. I was trained always in lecture to have what's called an essentials question or a thesis. So that question is at the bottom. What are the necessary multiple elements of an intellectual movement that make the movement an agent of great change? So what I want my students to get out of the lecture, this week of lecture, most of all, is to understand the broad range of enlightenment. So since I've got that on my mind, my lecture did the following things. I went into science and religion in the 17th and 18th centuries, the idea of absolutism, early industrial revolution, the Enlightenment concept, Voltaire and Adam Smith, and road to the French Revolution. And I pretty much, my lecture would go in that order. But you can see there's a series of topics in my lecture. So I can actually, these topics can be sort of like 20-minute segments of my lecture, 20, 25, 30-minute segments of my lecture. I have to choose which ones are most important. So as you can see behind the Enlightenment concept, I have the word, you know, the number 1. This is denoting to you that this is probably the hardest part of my lecture, the one that needs the most verbal. So you can see over here, I'm going to choose that to go live Zoom, or I'm going to choose that to go and record it for an asynchronous session, maybe record it verbally on Zoom, like Laura and I are doing right now. There are no audiences for us in this Zoom. We're just going and recording this for ourselves. So anyway, that would go into a live Zoom or a recorded verbal lecture. Then I would then host in YouTube or host on whatever my university provides for me as a hosting site for the students to access. The second one would be science and religion in the 17th and 18th century, also a very complex topic. Again, I would do that. The other things, such as the idea of absolutism, and then my comparison between the French and the English Enlightenment, meaning Voltaire and Adam Smith, those I can put into an activity, or I could do a video, or I could do a PowerPoint with screencast, or I can do a PowerPoint with embedded text. I don't have to go and provide a verbal recorded lecture or a Zoom lecture on these things. I tend to put these items into activities because they're simpler. And then notice, I also need my students to understand the early Industrial Revolution, and I need to know the road to French Revolution. These two I put definitely into PowerPoint with embedded text because they're pretty simple. The early industrial centers of Europe do not require a great deal of explanation. They are far more narrative or simple explanation. And then the road to the French Revolution, here I just put it into a timeline, okay? And then at the end, and this is a really good use of discussion board, if this is your essential question, or if this is your thesis for that week's of lecture, a good thing to do is do a discussion board at the end, because now the discussion board is giving the students all this information from lectures, from videos, from activities, whatever. They can now answer that question because they've got plenty of information to work with, okay? Now, how would that Monday or Tuesday class look if I was operating in a synchronous situation? Think of the class as a 60-minute, and again, my thinking is, I don't know that I need to go 75 minutes because I'm leaving some of this information over here, see take home, for the students to do that Industrial Revolution PowerPoint or presentation with embedded text. They're going to do this at home. So I don't need to use an entire 75 minutes because some of my lecture is being weighted over here into an at-home activity, okay? So I always start off with an entrance poll. If I'm in a synchronous mode, an image, a quote, a passage, a piece of video, something. I tend to always start off with a hook, okay? Then I would go into my Zoom lecture, or I would have my recorded lecture, maybe 20 minutes. In a Zoom lecture, I would definitely probably do a poll in the middle. Then I would move out of there and go into the activity, the idea of absolutism, my first activity of that list that I showed you. After that activity, I would basically bring the students back to main session. I would probably have the leaders of the various groups, if this is a class of like say 40, ask them to give me like a 20-second or 30-second synopsis of what their group found with regard to the activity. And I would probably want to try to tie that politics together with science and religion to sort of figure out what's happening as we lead up to the Enlightenment. And then I would always give a lecture quiz, you know, essentially in the last 5 minutes, I get it started. It can last for 10 minutes. It can be a 5-point lecture quiz. It can be a 10-point lecture quiz. It can be 15-point lecture quiz, whatever. But essentially it's covering this information that I delivered over here in the Zoom lecture or in the recording. So in an asynchronous situation, you would basically tell the students, do all these things in this order and then take this lecture. And you would put them in that order for the students, okay? So this is like one day of a synchronous class or the first part of an asynchronous class, but it follows that same thing where you're taking things and you're putting them into appropriate modes, okay? And each one of these modes is the appropriate way to go and put it forward.
Okay, so I do a lot of my lecturing in the asynchronous classroom, typically before COVID-19, but that is what the majority of instructors did was an asynchronous class. There were hybrid and stuff, but with this e-conference coming in and the massive crash course that everybody got in Zoom and Google Meets and so forth, I think we're going to see a lot more classes do synchronous mode. But asynchronous mode, you can still have your history lecture and make it powerful and make it work. But as Pat says, we do have to tweak it. And I love the fact that she mentioned the emphasis on your curriculum. Your curriculum really needs to step up its game in the asynchronous and synchronous classrooms in the online environment. So as you see, Pat talked about modes. There's a lot of different modes that we can deliver this content in. So if you're looking at my history class, I also start with an essential question. And what I love about Global Lyceum is that they also give me essential questions to work with in a lot of their writing assignments that I can easily dovetail into some of their content information. So we have the question here, why were the Civil War amendments essential to the American Constitution? Like Pat, I also use a discussion board for my big question. It's very important that you want your students to prove to you that they've understood that content information, your lecture information, and one of the best ways for them to do this is for them to write about it and give you a beautiful, polished discussion board post. And the cool thing about the online environment is you get a lot of your silent students. A lot of your students who wouldn't talk are going to have to participate in order to get their grade. So the discussion board is a really nice way to wrap up your lecture to make sure that they're understanding the points that you'd want to cover. And this does take place of that discussion that you would have in your lecture in the face-to-face environment. So it's a nice way to end the course. But you'll see, as Pat said, some of my lower just more content and memorization type material, I would put that in a different format. I would give the video on the 13th Amendment, I would make that a YouTube video. I beg, borrow, and steal from the internet all the time to add some really richness to my class. But then I'm going to take a couple of my lectures, like the last days of war, and I'm going to record that as a PowerPoint. I'm going to screencast it and then post it to my classroom in Global ICM via a link. Global ICM has these really rich short videos, and I'm going to take a couple of theirs to look at the Southern home front. And the Black Codes of Mississippi is an activity. So I'm taking all of the stuff that I would typically lecture in and finding varied modes. This also helps to keep the students' attention and helps to keep them more engaged with the class. And then I didn't do this before, but I've recently started taking my PowerPoints and just embedding them with text and then giving a quiz after. So I give them another short reading on something that I've already developed, and it just takes me maybe an hour to go and polish up and put it on, and then it's there for my future classes, and I can continue to tweak it as it goes on. So I also really, really like the Global ICM topical essays. The topical essays there is a kind of another PowerPoint form for me, because it goes through in the history portion. It either has a short reading with lots and lots of visuals and graphics and short videos and animations that really help prove a lot of those points, and it's completely polished. So again, I keep everything in Global ICM because it lets me have master control and it lets me tweak my content as we go. And I know Canvas does this, but Global ICM has all the content already in the library that you see on the right. So it's just much easier for me to do everything in Global ICM and tweak it and then take it to the two universities or the two colleges that I teach at. So you'll see there's a vast library. It has all the content there. It also has the ability for me to tweak and do activities on my own and include graphics and things like that. So that's why I host everything in Global ICM, but it definitely merges and connects to Canvas, which is my learning management system at both of my colleges. So you'll see I took that same weekly format, and this is exactly what a week looks like. I label it week 1, reconstruction in asynchronous mode. Everything you see here is what I put on my syllabus for that week. And then you have the videos, the reading, the quizzes, and the discussion board. And you also kind of label it in the way that you want them to attack it. So you'll start with the YouTube, the lecture, the video, the reading in the 2 years that changed America. And then they can download, open, and preview all of this material in Global ICM. As you see, Pat's opening up my 14th Amendment lecture. So you'll see the lecture. It's the typical PowerPoint that I've just upped my verbiage. So they have my speaker notes in a narrative format. But my graphic images, my text that I would use in my class, short, sweet, and to the point. You notice I don't have any more than 1 or 2 paragraphs of text on each page. And this is what I'd give in class. And this is what the students can take and receive in a written format, which can be equally as powerful to some as the verbal format.
And this is a video, the Southern Homefront.
So I pulled in a video from the library from my fellow historian, Libra Hildy.
And then,
but would also show that topical essay, because I don't think I gave it justice. So the topical essay here in Global Lyceum for the American History is done by a professional historian, well, I'm a professional historian, but is done by a notable historian who has some published work and award-winning work on the subject. And she has short little videos, there's graphic organizers, there's texts. It's kind of in that polished PowerPoint format. It's all audio recorded, so it's a beautiful lecture. And what I like about these versus some others that I've come across is that there's a thesis. And Pat really hit the nail on the head when she said you have to have a thesis that unifies your work for the week, an essential question that you're working to answer, and all of the information that I've compiled for this week all work to address what I would have done in the face-to-face class, but in very different modalities.
Okay, so I guess we can go on. And of course, I didn't open the Black Codes, but it's similar to what we talked about last week with background sources on the Black Codes. This is a very popular activity in Global Lyceum. And analyze the evidence with the graphic organizer here. Then you have options of opinion polls and quiz polls, etc. Okay, so I think we'll go on to psychology. So now I have to get back to my presentation. Okay, and I suppose I can just go and hit the presentation mode.
There we go.
Okay, great. Go ahead.
Okay, so now we have this, it's not new, but it's definitely become a lot more popular, the synchronous form of teaching online. And it's very similar to the asynchronous. You just get that interactivity that you would somewhat get in the classroom. Or so I guess you'd say you somewhat get this interactivity like you would in the classroom, but it is different. So you are, as Pat said, a little bit limited. You can't read the room as well, and you can't feed off of kind of their energy. But you can do some pretty cool things that really benefit student learning in the synchronous classroom with these Zoom live lectures. But what Pat said, I'm going to echo again, is we have to keep it short, and you still in the synchronous classroom need to use those different modes to make sure that they're not being pulled off in 5 different directions, checking their texts, leaving the room and ghosting you, doing all sorts of these habits. So if you really structure your class with these different modes and provide some activity inside your synchronous session, you're going to really set yourself up for success. So you'll see my week is broken down. I still have an essential question. This is for psychology, and this is what some of our psychology professors who've been using us before have done. But it says, how and why does this desire or need to be a part of the group create divisiveness in society? So this is the question, the group dynamics that we're trying to look at through this activity. And you'll notice the different modes. We've hit the live lecture with polls and quizzes, one on Monday, and then the in and out group dynamics lecture on Wednesday. So each class section, you're going to do a live lecture with a poll and a quiz for 20 minutes. And then beforehand, they're going to kind of come prepped by looking at that YouTube video on the conformity experiment. And they're going to do a primary source or psychological activity on the bike theft. So you'll see that each of these weeks have that. Pat, you want to hop in?
No, it's also hardwired us and then is an activity as well.
Yes.
This is one of the more recent ones that we love this activity because it's about Robert Sapolsky's work on the biological basis of in-group, out-group, which I did not even know. It was amazing work. Okay, anyway, so I just threw that in there. And this, Monday, this would be Monday from Ash to Robber's Cave, and then this would be Wednesday, the in-group, out-group down to stereotype, bias, and inevitable.
And I would still, even in my synchronous class, do a discussion response and a short answer response, either with a discussion board or where they turn it in privately as a one-off to me. So they would, you know, just as they would submit an assignment in Canvas, they would do the same in Global Lyceum, answering the essential question of the week. And Pat's going to pop over to Global Lyceum so we can kind of get a visual of how this all would work. So I have it labeled Monday, so this would be week 2. They would come to class and I would say, hey, you need to read in my weekly announcement, you need to read about watch the video on the conformity experiment. And then I would dive straight into a 20-minute lecture. And through my lecture, I would probably pull them in the beginning, the middle, and the end on what I was talking about. In the Zoom lecture, it's just a placeholder if you open it. And there I would also put my Zoom information for the day. So the students would...
Good to explain, Laura, that the way the placeholder is created is this little thing called create a page, so that you can load the video in there. You can also basically say to the student, okay, we're going to have this Zoom lecture. I want to be delivering this lecture, and I need you to see this ASH conformity experiment beforehand. So that's all that does, because you're actually going live. You don't have anything that you're presenting because everything's on your live lecture. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Exactly. And then we also have a great image library in Global Lyceum, or there is a great image library in Global Lyceum. And if Pat opens, like, you have all of these images. And I like using an image oftentimes as a focal point for my lectures or the start to my lectures. So you can open these and show these in live time and talk about what we see and how it fits in with your lecture topic. And you're looking at a particularly...
This is a sad one, exactly. This is people being taken to the concentration camp, and this little boy is actually a very famous picture of a little boy. These people are going directly into the concentration camp and into the chambers, the death chambers, and so it's really a compelling feature. It's a great hook, okay? It's a great hook for something in psychology, in my opinion. But of course, I speak as an historian, so go ahead. Go ahead, Laura.
So, then we have a poll that I would give in real time during my lecture. And what I also like about these polls is it gives us a chance to do text. And this also brings in that discussion element. I had a professor email me the other day and she said, I just miss the discussion element. And sometimes I don't feel like a discussion board hits that. And I think polling is another way to get that, because it's in live time and they get to do responses and you get to feed off of what they said. And sometimes they're a little bit more thoughtful because they're forced to write it than what they would be if they were just kind of giving you a verbal vomit. So a poll is a great way to kind of bring in that discussion activity in class. Then after my lecture or during class, I might have them do an activity together in those Zoom breakout rooms. So I would have them do the bike theft. And then they would read the other stuff on their own, because that's just information delivery. That's the stuff that I want them to do.
The Robert Cave experiment, which is a very famous experiment in in-group, out-group dynamics. Go ahead.
Yes, and then I would quiz them on everything. Short, low stakes quizzing is, in my opinion, is the way to go, especially in the online environment. My gradebook has probably about, I don't know, 30 to 40 at least, if not more, assignments. And students really do better with constant check-ins, constant quizzing, and that low stakes pressure, like, oh, if I blow this, it's okay, but I'm gonna stick with you because I have a due date to get this stuff all out of the week. Then on Wednesday, I'd start off with a Zoom lecture. And you'll see Wednesday, these are the items you need to come completed today in class, and these are the things that you're going to do at home after my lecture. So, and that's another thing too, and I don't think we brought that up, is it's very important if you're doing a Zoom lecture to let the students know the schedule and what they need to bring to the table. So if they need to have something completed, that needs to be very, very clear. And again, you need to follow that same format every time. So anytime you have the Zoom lecture placeholder, you want to put in everything that they'll need for that class or need to have completed, what happens during class and after class. And that really helps to give you structure too. Then you have an activity that you can do small group work with in Zoom. Follow it up by the quiz on your lecture. And you can beg, borrow, and steal these quiz questions from Global Lyceum to get your base and then add your own. And then
this would be the take home. Is stereotype-based bias inevitable? This is something that you would take home, and this is a real easy one. Again, a topical essay, only in this case, it's not side by side, it's in a straight format. The value of this is that there are numerous videos in these topical essays, okay, and a lot of graphics. So it's a little bit like having kind of a textual and verbal format, and also it's audio recorded. So as you can see, Cliff here has several videos where he's talking about 3-minute videos, all of them that are talking about the various things. That's why topical essay works pretty good as kind of a hybrid of the verbal and the textual together.
Very much so.
Like those, yeah.
They're very well done too, and very, very graphic and image and animation video rich, which is again hitting all of those different modes that we want students to engage with. And then I'd end the week with a short discussion. Or
Yeah,
a discussion,
discussion
or
board
this
or
one's
this.
not a discussion. This is a
Short answer.
graded short answer response.
Yeah, or it could be a discussion board. It could be either one. I just tried to show something a little different this way than the previous one when I was doing Laura's setup. So anyway, okay. So anything else here, Laura, or we're going to go ahead and move on?
We can move on.
Okay, so some of the things that we have told you have a lot to do with, okay, let me go ahead and move on to the next piece. This little chart here is some of the things that we talked about last week and that we're going to be talking, and we have talked about this week. You're using asynchronous and synchronous modes. That's a mode, that's a way of delivery, but there's a lot of variety within lecture, within activity, and within discussion. And Global ICM, we are helping professors all through the summer to basically use these different ways of presenting and ways of engaging and ways of helping students to discuss, to elicit discussion. So student engagement and presentation. We're showing them how you can do them in asynchronous completely, synchronous, but we suggest doing a little bit of both. In other words, if you're afraid of getting into Zoom so that you have a crash and burn, like I sort of had yesterday, okay? And you're like, oh no, I don't want to have that happen to me. Well, you know what? Let it happen to you. It's not the end of the world. Laura and I came back and we just did the recording. If I had a crash and burn in my classroom, I'd say, okay, so this didn't work out very well for me. Guess what I'm going to do? I'm just going to go and record it on Zoom, and then you're going to have it on your website tomorrow. Look for it, and it will be there. So that's what we're doing. We're kind of doing what a professor would do if they had to kind of salvage the situation. So it's always not to be afraid of Zoom, not to be afraid of synchronous. But if you feel like I really want to be mostly asynchronous and I want to dabble in synchronous, go there, do that, try that, okay? If you want to go and do mostly, you want to assign, analyze the evidence activities, or do some customized short responses mostly, but once in a while you want to go and see how you can do that breakout session and try an assignment in the breakout session and see if you can invite students to that and then do it, then you should do it. And the other thing with discussion board is try using varieties of discussion board. A very critical element is the discussion board that is actually the culmination of what's going on all week. It's your essentials question. Or you can try some other things, like we have some professors who do an online opinion poll where they assign it on a Monday, close it on a Tuesday, and then they follow that up with a discussion board, feeling that at least in the asynchronous, completely asynchronous mode, they get more discussion from the students when they do that. But then, of course, you can always go over to trying it out in the synchronous environment. I think every professor should think about whichever side they're most comfortable with, but dabbling in the other side. In other words, if you're going to go synchronous, make sure you do some asynchronous things. If you're going to go mostly asynchronous, try out a few synchronous things. This is a time for experimentation. And we're here all summer long to assist all professors to figure out what they want to do in the course of their semester. We help people line up that pattern that you need in online education with the pieces that you find the most interesting. So if you have any interest in doing this, we'll be sending out, along with this recording, information about how you can come to a 15-minute session with me. We'll probably be having some specific webinars for professors who are adopting Global ICM about how to get into the nitty-gritty of some of these pieces, showing very much detailed how do you do it. So we're planning on doing a series of these things with our professors. So if you'd like to become a Global ICM professor and use Global ICM materials, even if it's only for one semester or for online in the future, let us help you get into a really engaging online class. And we'd be very happy to do so. And I think that you'll find Global ICM's mix of lots of different pieces of content and technology to be really suitable for this kind of instruction. All right, so from Laura and me, bye-bye.